Heyo friends! So in this particular video, what we're going to do is really distinguish for ourselves the differences between the two genres, one of which we are probably a little bit more familiar with, the essay, and then the speech genre, which is certainly something we have some familiarity with in some of your cases, some direct experience with, but it's a slightly lesser known beast. So we want to make sure that we have a really clear idea of how these two genres are very similar, but more importantly, how they are different, so that when we actually sit down to the keyboard to begin drafting our persuasive speeches, we know exactly what to incorporate so that we do produce a speech and not just another essay. Now, in class, you were given two models, a speech delivered about vegetarianism and a formal research-based persuasive essay also about vegetarianism. Now, in using both of these models to guide your observation, you and your classmates came up with the following Venn diagram to sort of differentiate each of these two genres. Feel free to pause the video and just kind of take in the commonalities and also the distinctions between these two very distinct genres. All right, so now that you've had an opportunity to refresh your memory, let's go ahead and just drive home the high points. So first and foremost, as we have just seen, speeches and essays are definitely related. They are by no means the same thing. They certainly are genres that communicate important ideas. They can even be written about similar topics, and they can even share a similar purpose. An essay and a speech can both persuade. However, they're going to do so in very different ways. They each use a very different set of crafts, and they each have their very own unique structure. So one of the quotes that I always like to share with students as we set out to write speeches is by communication professor Bob Frank, who says, "A speech is not an essay on its hind legs," which essentially goes to communicate that we don't want to stand up at a podium and read an essay that we have written. That doesn't make for a speech. In fact, it makes for a really, really, really boring speech, to be honest. We want to make sure that when we sit down to write, we are writing something that is truly distinct from the essays that we have written in the past. Something that is intended to engage an audience, activate their minds, and truly persuade them, and then set them to work on the solution that you've identified. So let's review some advice. First off, we want to make sure that when we set out to write our speeches that we simplify our message. Speeches definitely require you to simplify beyond the message that you would write in an essay. So what we know through research is that the average adult can read about 300 words per minute. But by contrast, people can only follow speech closely at around 150 to 160 words per minute. That's literally half. So we are able to take in much more information in text than we are through our ears. That right there tells us we can't use the same amount of words in an essay as we will in a speech, because people simply cannot take in that much information that quickly. Now, the second piece of research-based evidence that really helps to back up this piece of advice is that the research out there that we have done on the brain suggests that our auditory memory is typically inferior to our visual memory. Especially in today's day and age, we have become a very visual species. We're used to absorbing information through our eyes, a lot less so than we are through our ears. Well, if we know that our auditory memory is inferior to visual memory, and our purpose as a speaker is to not just have our audience hear us, but also to really hold on to what we're saying, then this is another important piece of information that supports the necessity of simplifying. So what are we going to do? We're going to prioritize clarity and brevity. Brevity is just a fancy way of saying keeping it short and sweet. We want to explicitly state our thesis in our opening statement. We don't want to just infer it. We want to make sure that it is there in black and white so that our audience is very clear about what we are talking about, how we feel about it, and what we are trying to persuade them of. Throughout the body of our speech, we also want to incorporate what we call signposts or signal words that help our audience to sort of stay with us as we move throughout the pieces of our argument. That includes little phrases like to begin or furthermore. Last piece of advice here is that we don't want to overpack our paragraphs. Select only the most necessary points and evidence to share with your audience. That means be selective. You may have 3 incredible pieces of evidence in support of one of your claims, but if maybe 2 sufficiently make your point, perhaps you pare it down to the 2 strongest, the 2 best. All right, so tip number 2, we want to tell our audience a story. So yes, our speech and our argument should be fact-based, and it should be grounded in sound logic. Absolutely, that's just good argumentation. But we also want to go with what we know about the human brain and how it takes in information. Now, neuroscience has shown us that the human brain is hardwired for narrative. Our brain tends to hold on to and comprehend that information more effectively. So what that means in terms of writing a speech is we don't want to drown our audience in statistics and quotations. Some are great. Too many can be overwhelming and even confusing, which is counterproductive to our efforts. We also want to make sure that our audience is able to really internalize the information that we are sharing with them, because when it becomes part of them, if they really feel like they understand it, then they're more likely to change their perspective. And we do that by using evidence in the form of anecdotes and analogies and concrete examples that are sometimes a little bit easier to interpret and certainly easier to remember than hardcore numbers and facts. All right, now my third and final tip for you has to do with those stats and facts and quotes. They do still have a place within our speech, but we want to make sure that we are using them effectively. Now, stats and facts and quotes can be really, really helpful in terms of adding realism and significance to your presentation. Take the example, you have a 20% chance of surviving a 60-mile-per-hour crash if you don't wear a seatbelt. That particular statistic really drives home the importance of wearing a seatbelt, right? All of a sudden, that number really helps to create emphasis and draw their attention to the rest of your information. We also know that stats and facts and quotes, even though they're very logos heavy, can indeed have an emotional impact on our audience. Here's another example. In sub-Saharan Africa, almost 60% of youth between the ages of about 15 and 17 are not in school. Now that right there tugs at my heartstrings, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a serious problem. I feel terrible. Maybe I even feel guilty at what how privileged I am to have had the education that I did. And now all of a sudden I'm listening a little bit more carefully so that I can be part of that solution. Now, last but not least, it's also important to recognize that they can increase our credibility, which is super duper important when it comes to persuasion. We want to use those statistics to show that we've done our research and that we are super knowledgeable about our subject matter. They are therefore going to be more likely to trust us, believe us, and change their opinions. All right, now just the last few pro tips for you. Think about bringing your statistics to life by framing them in terms of a story. Tell the story of that number. For example, if your statistic is about the number of billionaires in the world, then maybe you might begin by telling the story of Mark Cuban from Shark Tank, and then reveal that he is only one of over 2,000 such billionaires. So we're still using a statistic, but we're sort of sneaking it in there in the form of a story. We also want to make sure that we don't over-rely on our audience to understand how the statistic is relevant to our particular topic. Don't leave your audience to connect the dots. Just go right ahead and connect the dots for them. And you can do that by using phrases like, this is important because, or this means this. Lastly, you want to make sure that you're attributing your facts and stats and expert testimony to their sources. Now, yes, you are going to be embedding citations into your transcript, but those will not be read aloud to your audience. So that means that we also need to make sure that we are using phrases like according to, right? So that we are giving reference to where information came from when it's appropriate. All right, so in conclusion, keep it simple. Remember that clarity, brevity are definitely our friends. When it is possible, we want to tell them a story. Really lean into those anecdotes and analogies and examples. This is your opportunity to really have fun with these. You'll have a million other research papers to write in the future that can be super, super duper number and fact heavy. But here, really embrace the power of the story. And then last but not least, when we do use those stats, facts, and quotes, make sure that they are indeed audience friendly. All right, keep these tips in mind as you get ready to start your draft.